Former Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Matt Hancock, is the next to give evidence to our lockdown inquiry. Matt, hello. Firstly, I appreciate you entering the lion's den, really, tonight, because it's fair to say that I have been one of the longest-standing critics of the government's lockdown policy, and you are obviously one of its biggest proponents, arguably one of its architects. So we have a short amount of time tonight. We did actually offer you the full hour, Matt, but you went for about a third of that. So let's have a respectful exchange. Let's get through things quickly. No bloviating, because obviously there's lots of points to cover.
Sure.
So any government must make decisions that weigh up the benefits of the measures that they introduce against the harms that they cause. You would agree with that, right?
100%.
And previously, the UK had an influenza pandemic preparedness strategy dated in 2011. It was meant to be used for coronaviruses as well. And that intended that the public be able to continue their normal lives without border closures, without the end of mass gatherings, without work from home orders, without school closures. So do you accept that there were detailed plans in place for the UK that would have preserved normality and proportionality during a pandemic?
Well, those plans were written for a different disease. And so
they were written for coronaviruses.
They were written based on influenza. And the preparations had been based on the threat of a pandemic flu. And those preparations, some parts of them were incredibly important and incredibly helpful, like putting through some of the legal changes that were needed, that were ready and drafted. But you're right in the starting point of your question, which is you have to balance in any government decision, but especially in these really big ones, these huge weights on either side.
Yes, so fundamentally, you abandoned that plan. That is fair to say. So given the huge risks involved with abandoning a plan like that, which had been thought through for a long time, why was the decision made to never do a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis or impact assessment of non-pharmaceutical interventions, including lockdown? Or were they done and we just weren't told about them?
So the plans that we had, the preparation was based on pandemic flu. That's what the exercises have been done on. And obviously at the time, we then had to make decisions according to the situations we found it. A new coronavirus, which was unprecedented. And the hard part, of course, was that we were in this fog of uncertainty in terms of the lack of data.
To begin with, yes.
Yeah.
But there was never a full cost-benefit analysis done at any point, was there?
Well, there was as much of an assessment as you can make in the incredibly short amount of time. And the challenge that we had was that the forecasts of increased cases and increased deaths, the problem wasn't the forecast. The problem was that the forecasts were coming true. And that was the fundamental challenge. So you have to look at the costs, not just the costs, the economic costs in terms of mental health, the costs in terms of people not being able to access other types of treatment, and the costs of inaction. And we could see that the costs of inaction were going to be absolutely enormous.
OK, look, I want to get to some specifics. Did you sign off the order from the NHS CEO to discharge elderly patients from hospital back into care homes without testing them in March 2020?
Well, in March 2020, we didn't have the tests that we needed. We didn't have a testing regime. That's one of the lessons of the pandemic. We didn't have a testing regime at any scale. But what we
At what time do you say you didn't have enough tests?
Well, at that time, I mean,
because between the 17th of March and the 15th of April, about 25,000 people were discharged from hospitals into facilities. That's according to the National Audit Office. And by that point, you already had capacity for 10,000 daily tests. And there were over 530,000 tests carried out in the UK by the 20th of April. So there was a testing capacity available. You chose not to use it on people being discharged into the care homes.
Well, it had to be clinically prioritised. And to clinically prioritise...
No, but you just said the tests weren't available. Well, so I'm just making the point that they were available.
No, what I said was enough tests weren't available. Important difference, right? Because then once you have a certain amount of tests, and we started with, 100 tests a day, and then we got up, you're right, to 10,000 tests a day. I think it was by the end of... by the start of April, and then I set that 100,000 tests a day target to make sure we had a lot.
Yes,
right.
I know, but this was the key moment.
Yeah,
this was the key moment when you had to make the choice.
Right.
Well, let me just ask: did care home operators warn your department right at the start of the pandemic not to discharge hospital patients into care homes without a test? Did they warn you of that?
We didn't have enough tests available to be able to do that without removing tests from other people for whom they were a life-saving matter.
But do you acknowledge you were warned of that?
I don't have recollection of that.
OK, well, the Care Provider Alliance, this is important, they emailed you directly. They didn't email your department, they emailed you directly. And they said all people discharged from hospital to social care settings must be tested before discharge.
But the thing is...
So did you get that email or not?
The thing is that in a situation like a pandemic, right, where you have a limited capacity for testing, and we needed a bigger capacity, and we were building that bigger capacity, you've then got to decide, OK, how do we use these tests?
Yes.
And you've got to, as the politician in that environment, you've got to follow the clinical advice on what use of tests is most likely to save lives. And then I'll come back to the social care point, because this is really important. There has been an analysis done of how the virus was most likely to get into care homes. And the proportion of infections that got in from discharges, according to the evidence, is around 2%. Because actually, people who work in care homes live in the community.
Look, I've heard you make that claim before, Matt. Let me just pick you up on it. This is important. Well, I know what you say the facts are. But do you know? No. I've got it here.
It's not 2021. What I say the facts are. It's just the published facts.
It's a 2021 Public Health England report, right? That's where it comes from. But that data has been dismissed by care operators because they point out that only some people were being tested. So it's actually impossible to know. Take Vic Rayner, Chief Executive of the National Care Forum, that says the data behind that analysis was fundamentally flawed. And there are others who say that you're actually trying to rewrite an element of history to suit a current narrative.
On the contrary, what I'm trying to do here, and this is really important... And actually,
but how could you know if they weren't tested? You must understand that point.
So, hence, that analysis was done by testing samples and trying to find what the best estimate of the truth, and get to the bottom of what are the facts.
Okay.
And this is one of the reasons I've come on the programme. I think it's really important that we learn these lessons. Number one lesson is have and maintain a big testing capacity, right?
Absolutely.
We didn't have that when I was in the hot seat, but hopefully next time, that will be there and ready. But we've got to get to the evidence-based facts in order to learn the right lessons. Because actually, there's another big...
What happened in care homes was incredibly important, and so
I know, and so I was about to say that actually there's a really big other thing that happened that doesn't get this sort of scrutiny in that space, which is that over the summer of 2020, we put in place a rule to say staff shouldn't move from one care home to another. Actually, that is the thing that is credited by the analysis as making sure that we had much better performance, frankly, in care homes in the
it was these, and I understand that, and you did make that decision later on. I get that, but so far we've been talking about sending COVID-positive patients coming from hospital. Right?
No,
that's what the discussion is about.
That's not true. We're talking about sending people from hospital, and they were sent.
But some were COVID positive and they were not tested,
and they were all isolated. They were all treated as if they might have the disease. So, and actually,
although care home providers describe the isolation plan as laughable.
I will, and I'll give you this other, case in this argument, which is that the increase in infections that we saw in care homes happened later than after, significantly after, the point at which there were these discharges. So the the point is important, Dan, because because actually what we have to do is learn the right lessons. So what I'm planning to do...
that's what I'm trying to do, because the Department of Health also sent out guidance during the first wave saying COVID-positive residents with symptoms, so this is with symptoms, we're not even talking about asymptomatic people here, could be admitted from a home setting into a care home. Why did you think that was safe?
Because you have to work out, based on the clinical advice, what is the most likely thing to protect lives.
From Italy and you knew from China that the mortality rates in elderly people was incredibly high.
It's incredibly simplistic to make this argument. You have to look at your likelihood...
What's simplistic about it?
Well, I'm about to explain. Your likelihood, for instance, of... there are people who need to go in to get care because their risk of mortality if they stay at home is high. You have to take that into account as well. So we've got to look at all of the different points, and that's what we did look at the time.
You told Andrew Marr last June you didn't put a protective ring around care homes during the first wave of the pandemic. Have a look.
That phrase, protective ring, do you at least regret that?
Well,
it wasn't true, was it?
I said that much later about what we were doing for the winter plan, and it's been interpreted.
Do you stand by what you told Andrew Marr?
I used that phrase. I used that phrase later, to describe the work that we did to learn the lessons from the first phase, the first wave, which meant that actually, in terms of protecting.
But I've looked into that. I've looked into that, and it's just not true, Mr. Hancock, because you actually used the phrase multiple times at the start of the pandemic, well before the winter plan. Look.
Right from the start, it's been clear that this horrible virus affects older people most. So right from the start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes.
Well, we absolutely did throw a protective ring around social care, not least with the £3.2 billion worth of funding we put in right at the start, topped up with £600 million worth of funding on Friday. Further to that, the Honourable Lady, I think, does know that testing has been carried out in care homes throughout. And I'm glad we've been able to protect the majority of homes. And we'll keep working to strengthen the protective ring that we've cast around all our care homes.
So when you were telling the truth, then or to Andrew Marr?
Both. Because
how can they both be true?
Because you've just played those clips from May, and your criticism about the discharge
before the winter
was
plan.
March, right? So.
But you're talking about it's in May. You're talking about what you did in May and April.
There's two ways of describing.
So you're not talking about what you did in May there. You're talking about what you did in March and April.
There's two ways of answering this. The first is that the issue you were raising about people having to move out of hospital in order to be able to save lives in hospitals, right? That was in March 2020. Later, I used this phrase, throwing a protective ring, in May. So it's absolutely true, the chronology. But there's a second point, which is much more important, which is we've got to step back from this, right? We've got to step back from looking at each, picking out individual points. We've got to ask the question, how do we make sure we're better prepared next time?
No, I get that. I get that. So but I want to talk about some of the individual points, because then we paint a picture.
No, you've gone into specific and individual points. But there's a reason I want to say this. There's a reason I want to say this, because I think it's very important that especially given the role that I had, that I both answer these questions, but also set out the whole piece.
Of course.
So I'm writing a book about the experience, what it looked like from being Health Secretary, what actually happened at the time. To make sure that we set the whole set of details out, and absolutely to cover, important questions like this that you're raising, and also the broad piece, because you've got to
indeed.
Look,
we're going to do some big picture, but the specifics are important, and I'm coming to why they're so important. Because, of course, at this time, the line of public health messaging, you would say, propaganda, I might say, was protect the NHS.
Yes.
That's the message you were going out with.
Yeah.
But do you now concede that the facts show, the statistics show, that the NHS, even at the peak of you discharging patients into care homes, was never at risk of being overwhelmed? So these care home residents actually didn't have to be rushed out, Mr. Hancock?
No, that's simply not true.
OK, so the peak COVID day was the 12th of April 2020. There were 17,152 inpatients that day. Figures from the National NHS Operational Dashboard, which have recently been confirmed by the NHS to the Sunday Times, shows that 40.9% of NHS general acute beds were unoccupied as of that weekend.
Yeah, so firstly, obviously it's not...
It's not even close to being overwhelmed.
Well, if you let me answer the question. Firstly, it's obviously not true, and anybody who was there knows that it wasn't true.
These statistics are wrong?
Well, I guess you didn't go to a hospital at
No, I
this point.
didn't.
No, right, so...
But I'm using this
there.
on the stats.
So let me explain the stats. COVID is a disease largely that affects people when they end up in hospital because it affects their lungs. Mm-hmm. So you ended up with a huge amount of people essentially with broadly the same condition, as opposed to the general beds, and we didn't want people to be catching COVID in hospital either.
But you're talking about ventilator beds here?
Not just ventilated beds, but even if you weren't on a ventilator, you know, those 17,000 people all basically had the same condition.
These are just statistics, Mr. Hancock. On the peak
that's
COVID
the point, and I'm
case
describing the facts.
42% of ventilator beds were unoccupied, as were 32% of intensive care beds and 44% of general and acute beds. And, of course, the Nightingale units, which you produced at great expense.
Incredibly important, yeah.
Why? They were mothballed. They were never used.
Yes, they were used. And if one of your relatives was cared for in a Nightingale hospital, you wouldn't take that dismissive attitude. They were used, albeit in smaller numbers than the capacity, but that's because I wanted a capacity that was bigger than what we had. Of course I did. And the reason for this, let's step back, right? The reason that the NHS was not overwhelmed is because we brought in the measures to control the virus. And the strategy all along...
Well, that is disputed. You know that is disputed.
It's just a fact, OK? It's science. And you've got to base your analysis on science. And the fact is this...
The infection rates were going down before the next lockdown.
We had a strategy which was based on protecting the NHS until the vaccine made us safe. And decisions about lockdown before and after vaccines were widely distributed were different and are different. And that's important.
I'll take a step back too. Yeah. And the reason why I've focused so much on this care home situation is because my proposition is that you monumentally botched protecting care homes by sending COVID-positive patients back without testing. That killed tens of thousands of people at the start of the pandemic. And then you felt, as a result, that you had to overcompensate with the Protect the NHS message, when, as those statistics show, the NHS was not close to being overwhelmed. Well, am I wrong?
You are wrong. You've got your chronology wrong. You've got your facts wrong, and you've got your science wrong. But other than that, it's quite good. Let's go through those.
Every statistic that I've produced is
let's go. Yeah, but not in that question that you just asked and the accusation that you made. Okay.
So your alternative.
Yeah. First off, you said that there was an overreaction in terms of protect the NHS because of what happened in care homes. But the major peak in care homes came later. It came in April, whereas we started talking about protect the NHS earlier in March.
It came in April because that'd been dismissed.
Hold on. Second point is that the reason that we had to discharge people was we didn't have the testing enough available because we needed the tests to save lives of people who were in hospital. And we had the arrangements as best as we could in place for isolation. But the third critical point is that the evidence shows that the way that the disease got into care homes was largely from the community, not from those transfers.
Okay.
All of these points are second order to the fact that, of course, people changed their behaviour to reduce social contact.
Exactly. And you know my position is that you should have trusted the British people to change their behaviour in the way that certain
other countries did. Somewhat, which is why it started to move, but not enough to stop the pandemic.
On to care homes and show you these pictures of students returning to the school in UK in the COVID era, and you know what the impact was like for children. And given the impact of school closures on children were predicted and actually predictable, and you've seen from the recent Ofsted report what happened, did you just decide that children should be collateral damage?
No.
So why did you shut schools?
Because we needed to stop the growth of the pandemic, which otherwise was going to overwhelm the NHS and kill many, many more people.
Do you regret using that expression, kill your granny, given the mental health impact that it's had on many children, now provably by statistics? Was that the right approach to take with children?
Well, we had to communicate as effectively as possible the importance of stopping this disease from spreading and killing more people.
Do you not regret it?
The thing is, Dan, and you'll have to wait for the book to see the full details of what happened. The thing is, we were saving lives, and we were working incredibly hard to do that.
You were saving lives from COVID. That I appreciate.
Right.
But I also, something
and
that I've been very
the scale of deaths
concerned
from
about.
COVID without action would have been
But do you
very
know the
significant.
scale of deaths from lockdown? Do you have any idea of the number?
Well, I'll give you an example. If you look at the Lancet paper recently published, at the total number of excess deaths compared to a normal year, the UK in 2020 was no higher than, and on some measures lower than, the average amongst the OECD.
Yes, but many of the deaths from lockdown you would concede are going to come in the years and potentially decades to come. But look, I want to talk about...
Hold on. You can't disagree with the Lancet paper.
No, but I'm talking about the deaths from lockdown that will come from missed cancer treatments, for example. You're not going to see that immediately in the statistics, are you?
Well, that Lancet paper looks over a 2-year period and is effectively... the best way to look at all of the effects. I agree with you that all of the impacts need to be taken into account.
Of course, there were human tragedies, though, as a result of lockdown. And one that really hit me hard that I want to mention was the murder of Arthur Labinjo Hughes. That poor boy's relatives were warned by the authorities to stay away because of lockdown, as his evil father and stepmother slowly beat him to death. His uncle, I'm sure you're aware, was actually threatened with arrest when he told police he was planning to check up on his nephew Arthur. And when Arthur died, he had more than 130 areas of bruising on his body, which Jonas Hancock, QC, who was the prosecutor, described as a bruise for every day of lockdown. Arthur was the reason schools should never have been closed, right?
Well, this is an awful case. And there are many cases, including Arthur's, of suffering as a consequence of the pandemic.
But was it wrong to allow a situation to develop where that little boy could be abused, where his relatives were banned from seeing him, where he wasn't at school, he wasn't being checked up by his teachers, he wasn't being checked up by social workers? That was wrong, wasn't it? Surely you can concede that.
Well, I don't know the individual details of that case. But what I can tell you is that it's harrowing.
It is. What about the overall cost of lockdown policies? I want to play you this clip. And this was when 2 grieving sons were separated from their widowed mother at the Crown Hall Crematorium in Milton Keynes, not in the first wave. This was on the 6th of October 2020. Have a look.
It's my privilege to have been asked to conduct our service today to celebrate the life of Alan Wright. I therefore offer you all a very warm welcome as we unite in love and friendship to...
You have to put the chair back, I'm afraid. You can't move the chair to a side.
Your policies, Mr. Hancock, caused situations like that, caused grieving folk to miss the final moments of their relatives' lives, caused fathers to miss the birth of their children. Do you accept at all that there was overreach on your part and that form of human suffering was not worth it?
What I accept in my response to that is that there's a need in implementation of policies for compassion, and we try to write that in. One of the things I've talked about is that in the first phase, often at funerals, people were not, people felt that they shouldn't, or were told that they shouldn't go, even if they were incredibly close.
But this was
and we changed that. Yeah. So you did see,
months on.
Of course, you saw consequences like that. But
People are
Dan,
still
step
being
back,
locked out
step
of
back.
hospitals now.
There's a reason that these policies were in place, and the reason is that the scale of the impact in terms of the deaths from letting COVID run without restraint would have been worse. And that is, there's no way, you can't get away from the fact that that's true.
The problem is, Mr. Hancock, some people thought that you became too lockdown focused. Now, maybe it's because you were working within the NHS.
Oh,
I just want to ask you about June 2021 specifically, because at that point you were part of this quad, the government quad. So it was Boris, it was Rishi Sunak, it was Michael Gove, and it was you. And there was a meeting to discuss in June 2021 whether lockdown restrictions should be extended, whether Freedom Day, remember that, should be delayed. Now, the Daily Telegraph have revealed that 3 days before this meeting, you came into possession of Public Health England data that revealed really high effectiveness of the vaccines against the Delta variant. Because remember, lots of people were vaccinated by that point. But you didn't share that data in that meeting. And partly as a result of that, lockdown restrictions were extended for another 5 weeks. Is it true that you withheld that information? And if so, why?
I don't recognise that at all. I mean, you're
multiple sources familiar with the meeting said it was not raised by Mr. Hancock or discussed at all during the talks. The data was also not included in briefing papers given to the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, or Michael Gove in advance of the meeting.
Well, it sounds like... you'll have to wait for the book on that one, because I don't know anything about it. But what I can...
So you're not prepared to say whether you withheld this data or not?
I've absolutely no idea about that account. And I certainly didn't withhold data.
It was on the front page of the Daily Telegraph, so I imagine you were aware.
I certainly didn't withhold data. I can be categoric about that. Because hold on, come on. What happens is you ask questions and I answer them, so I'll carry on. So my approach, right, was to use all the data we possibly could to make decisions. But the critical point about lockdown is that it was necessary until the vaccine could make us safe. It was necessary because otherwise the scale of death would be much greater.
6 months into the vaccine rollout.
In this case, this question about there was no question about withholding data. I've absolutely no idea, but I will look into it for you and make sure that I have a look at that report and try to understand what actually happened and what led to it being written. But these things there was lots and lots of words written about what went on in those meetings, and not all of them were 100% accurate.
No, I can imagine. Look, our time is nearly out. There's so much more I could ask you and want to ask you, so you will have to come back when your book is released. But just step back for a moment and look at the consequences of lockdown, because I appreciate what you're saying in terms of COVID. Of course I do.
Yeah.
But what I'm not getting is any sense of regret about what the British public were put through at times unnecessarily.
Well, the word that I disagree with in your question there is unnecessarily, right? And that's because these were big weights on both sides of the scales, and they were big judgments. And I always was cognizant of the impact of the decisions that we were taking, but I was also acutely aware of the huge damage that would have come.
So no regrets at all?
That's not quite what I said. But what I say is that I understood that there were impacts on both sides, absolutely. And the goal was to get the right balanced outcome. And especially before the vaccine, we knew that if you didn't have measures in place, then the impact would have been very terrible indeed.
Matt Hancock, I very much appreciate you giving evidence to the lockdown inquiry, and do come back when the book is out. Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.